our next speaker, before actually I introduce the next speaker, can I just admire what was happening down at the door there? And all the conferences I've done, and there are quite a few, I've never seen any company stand at the door and mug people on the way in by handing them stuff. It's a very clever move, and to be commended. Well done. So Daniel Batey is Managing Director for Union Data, and what he wants to speak about is how you use data to understand customer behaviour. So, Daniel.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining me at this breakout session today. I hope you've enjoyed the conference so far. I certainly enjoyed this morning's speakers. A couple of points that resonated with me when Kate talked about the extreme period of change we've been going through. And Dave was talking about turning data into decisions and starting with the customer. These are very much the themes of my talk today. So today I'm going to talk about customer behavior and how quickly it is changing. And then I'm going to share 4 examples of bespoke data strategies that may help you thrive in this ever more complex world. I hope to demonstrate that analysis of your first-party data can help you understand the changing behavior of your customers so that you can spot changes and you can react quickly. I'm happy to take questions, but I think we'll probably keep them towards the end if that's all right. Unless there's something leaping out at you that you have to ask, feel free to put up your hand. First, though, I'll quickly introduce myself and the company I work for. My name is Daniel Batey. I've been working in the marketing data industry for about 25 years now, and I've been very fortunate enough to work on data for many different blue-chip clients across many different industries, both in the UK and also abroad. One technology story I thought I'd quickly share over my career is the word CRM. So I don't remember back in the 90s, you're probably too young for this, but it was the massive new thing. Huge amounts of money were poured into CRM. The dot-com bubble burst, and it became a dirty word, because none of that investment that was poured into CRM actually delivered the promise that was realized. But since that point, CRM, or maybe customer experience as we might now call it, has obviously boomed since that point. And now it's deemed essential for all modern organizations. It's probably a classic Gartner hype cycle, if you like. But it also reflects how customer data analytics has changed, with more and more organizations realizing the value they've got locked up in their data, and that collecting good quality first-party data is really, really essential. So I work for Union Data. Union Data is part of the Union Advertising Agency, which is a full-service independent marketing services agency based here in Edinburgh. And as we've grown, we've extended our offering to different specialisms through Direct, which is obviously our direct response and CRM area, Connect for field and partnerships, Digital, mainly about building websites, but digital, of course, cuts across all of the areas of the business. And then finally, Union Data. We're the sort of newest kid on the block, if you like. We help our clients harness the power of data to improve their marketing effectiveness. We call our approach data sharpening. Hopefully you've seen that on the pads you've just been received. Which means the clever use of data to sharpen the focus of your marketing on its most important element: the recipient, the customer, the donor, the supporter, or the citizen, whatever industry you might be in, or whatever word fits your organization best. So customer behavior is changing. I presume nobody disagrees with that statement. Clearly, we've just been through very challenging times, and we're still in very challenging times. The war in Ukraine, customer crisis in terms of spending. And Kate talked about that very, very eloquently earlier. So I'm going to start by highlighting a few changes that I find particularly interesting. The first one of these is the move to a cashless society. There's been a huge shift in how we transact over the last 10 years, or actually probably only about 8 years. And you can see from this graph, the line going downwards there, it shows the number of cash transactions. It's gone from 21 million to only about 6 million in a short space of time. Even my dad, who's 89 years old, he now doesn't use cash, and he's happy using a card. It just shows you how prevalent now cashless society is. And what about the Edinburgh Festival? 3 years ago, the last time it was held, certainly some street performers had card machines, but not many. But I bet this year, when it finally comes back, pretty much all street performers will have card machines at their side. The reason I think this one is interesting, though, is because it's actually quite different to most digital transformations or transitions. Many digital transitions have actually reduced the human element and reduced the human interaction. Think of social media. You know, most people have an avatar or a pseudonym they hide behind. A lot of that transaction, or a lot of that communication is anonymous. Twitter trolls being an obvious example. AI chatbots, okay? Human interaction is reduced. But this cashless society is actually the opposite. It's less anonymous, okay? Transactions are much, much more auditable. There's a much clearer audit trail. This is a good thing, of course, because money laundering is much, much harder when there's an audit trail. But we also got to be aware that we may also be more exposed. What would happen if we were the victim of a phishing attack or a hack? With all of our financial data tied up in one place, that does expose us to slightly more risk. Another interesting stat from this, 86% of UK consumers are now using fintech services to manage their finances. Now, that didn't exist probably 5 years ago, or certainly 10 years ago. The next customer behavior is the obvious one, COVID. Could not mention it really. But this graph puts it pretty starkly. This is from an e-commerce client. They experienced a 1,200% sales uplift in their e-commerce business in 2 weeks. Now that is a pretty staggering change and a tough challenge for any business to cope with. I'll talk more about the impact of this a little bit later, so I won't dwell on it now. Another change that's been happening over the last few years is the move to subscription services, with 82% of households now receiving subscription services. And that's up from 65% from just the year before. That's a huge increase. And the average length of time customers are using this service has gone up from under 6 months to 9 months. Now, I'm a data person, so I would actually say that the average length of time is probably not the best measure here, because that hides an underlying behavior here. Most people, when they sign up to a subscription service, they either start it, they try it, and many, many people immediately cancel after a month or two. But the ones who do stay then tend to stay a long time. So that distribution is really, really important, and a much better measure than a simple average that's shown here. I saw this statistic, which was astounding. 2/3 of retailers are planning to launch a subscription service. If this comes to pass, that will certainly mean more disruption to how we shop and more disruption for the high street, even though it's already just gone through COVID. But the interesting question that I would ask about subscriptions, though, is have they actually missed the boat? There were 1.5 million subscriptions cancelled in just the first 3 months of this year. I'm sure you've seen the stories about Netflix and how they've actually, for the first time, reduced the number of subscribers they have in the UK. It's the first time in their history. So has subscriptions, has this trend run its course? Will customer behavior revert back to what it was? I can certainly see some reasons why it could. The cost of living crisis being an obvious one. Some consumers and some households will certainly cut back on some of the subscription services if they deem them non-essential. But how will we know? If I was a CEO of a subscription business at the moment, I would be all over my data team, trying to understand what's going on, to see how my particular market is changing. What is happening to my customer acquisition costs? What's happening to my lifetime value? These are the interesting questions that comes from this. The next trend I'd like to talk about is, of course, ethics. This is definitely a trend that's changing customer behavior significantly. And of course, it's a trend that I hope will continue for the sake of all of us. But 60% of consumers are now interested in the provenance of products and services. 60%, that's a huge proportion. So no more greenwashing, because that just won't cut it anymore. I'm now going to take it into our industry. Look at this graph on the right here. This graph, how we as marketers are possibly contributing to climate change. This shows the cost per sale and also the CO2 generated per sale across different media channels. So I'll start on the right-hand side. Email, very low cost per sale, and pretty low on CO2 per sale. As you'd probably expect, you've got an email base, they're your core audience, you can target well, very, very easy and very good ROI on email marketing. On the left-hand side, you've got offline channels. Now, the cost per sale for offline channels is much, much higher. Now, I'm not surprised by that. Most above-the-line offline channels like TV, press, and radio, their main message is actually about the brand. And they're not necessarily measured in the same way. It's not necessarily about the direct sales impact. It's about the long-term sales impact of your brand messaging. Ooh. So let's look at the ones in the middle. Print. Now, print has often been regarded as very wasteful. Paper uses a lot of paper. But that's actually a misconception. If you think about it, direct mail or door drops, they are more expensive. For every single contact you make, they can be quite expensive to produce catalogs, brochures, mailings, okay? But because it's so expensive, we in the data industry have made enormous gains in how we target those audiences. So we wouldn't blanket people with direct mail. That's just not going to be effective. So we are very, very targeted. And that targeting, as you can see from the graph here, has driven down the cost per sale and has also reduced the CO2 per sale compared to other channels. Which leaves me with digital. Now, you might be surprised by that graph. I certainly was the first time I saw it. Digital channels actually have the highest CO2 footprint. How can that be? If you think about what digital channels obviously have an enormous reach. You're talking to millions of people at any one time, whether that's through social or any other digital channels. Okay? And if you think about what they are when you're sending out those messages, those could be high-res images, it could be streaming videos. And all of the electricity to download all of those images, all of those videos, takes electricity. And all of that electricity generates CO2. If you're interested in the algorithm that sits behind that, this is something we're working with a partner on, so I'll be outside after this. Feel free to grab me later. The final customer behavior, oh, sorry, that's the wrong direction. The final customer behavior I'd like to talk about, and this is one from the inimitable Mark Ritson of Marketing Week. He showed that COVID had obviously massively changed things, but he made the very important point that we're actually getting back to trend quite quickly. This graph shows e-commerce as a % of retail sales in the US. I'm sure the figures are probably similar here. You can clearly see the spike when COVID hit in Q1 2020. But look what's happened since. It's declined back to where it was pretty much on trend. So like Mark Ritson, I don't agree that the world has changed forever from COVID. COVID accelerated some changes that are already taking place, and this is a perfect example of that. It also caused some massive spikes away from trend, like the earlier graph I showed on the e-commerce. But we are getting back to some sort of normality. Life is returning to offices, conference centers for the first time in quite a while. Customer behavior has changed in the last 2 years, probably quicker than many other periods of time. But many of those changes may well have happened already, anyway. So the most important message from these various examples I've talked about, is the world is always going to change. It's constantly, continually evolving. And customer behavior also changes in the same way. So what can we do as marketeers? What should we do? Firstly is don't panic. I think the COVID crisis probably was probably one of the biggest ones to hit us. But change rarely happens at the speed that you don't have time to react. Let's hope that COVID was actually a black swan event and not something that's going to happen again. And I actually think that Bill Gates got this right back in 1996 with this quote. We always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. If you agree that change is happening, my main message, similar to Kate at the beginning, is you need to have a plan. You need to have a strategy for understanding customer behavior so you can react accordingly and quick enough to make good decisions. I would argue that the best way to build that strategy is through data analytics, specifically analyzing your own customer data. Now, I have used the term customer quite a lot today, but I will say, of course, that supporter, donor, citizen could easily be replaced in that word instead of customer. But the key point is that analyzing this first-party data that already flows through your organization is the key to understanding how your particular customers are changing and to determine how their needs are changing. I believe that no two organizations are the same. Even within the same industry, they'll have different brands. They'll have a very different history of how they've put out their marketing. The people in the business will have different opinions. And all of these little differences will make every single organization unique. And if every organization is unique, that then means they need a bespoke strategy to understand their particular circumstances. And we talk about one concern I have with AI and automation. I know I'm a data person, so I should be a big fan of AI and automation. Don't get me wrong, I am. AI and automation is very, very good. But one slight caution with AI is that it optimizes for the largest group of people. Mathematically, it aims for the highest probability of success, however that success is defined. And the consequence of that is that actually it's aiming for averages, because more people cluster around those averages. If every organization then uses the same algorithms or similar ones, the differences between brands actually reduces. This could stifle creativity and reduce the distinctiveness of any particular brand. I will repeat, I'm not against, and I'm not arguing against AI and machine learning. I'm just saying use a little bit of caution. It's the excessive use of AI or the careless use of AI in marketing that could reduce the standout of your brand. So this is a MarTech conference, so I'm going to talk a little bit about technology. I'm glad Kate shared the MarTech slide earlier with the 9,000, was it, brands, different technology companies. I resisted the temptation to put it up. All the examples I'm about to talk about are made possible by the detailed analysis of customer behavior. And accessing and analyzing that data is, of course, dependent on your particular marketing stack or MarTech stack. So my one bit of advice, and it's similar to some of the stuff we heard this morning, think about the platform and choose one that helps you to liberate that data. Make it more accessible and more digestible. Accessible and digestible for data analysts like myself, for your data scientists. Accessible and digestible for other technologies too. At any point in time, it's impossible to determine all of the possible uses of your first-party data. So if you can make that data as accessible and digestible as possible, it will help you over the longer term. So that's the data available. I'm now going to talk about 4 examples. Now, Luigi in the talk earlier talked about accessing data to make decisions, and that's very much what I'm going to talk about now. It's about those decisions on the back of these data strategies. So the first one I've called Know Your Customer and Know Your Problem. This is from a D2C e-commerce business from a few years ago. It's fairly typical. As they grew in the early years, you can see that their marketing spend went up and their customer growth went up. All good. But you can see also that in 2018, a few years ago now, but it's still relevant in terms of the message, marketing spend went down a little bit. Orders also went down a bit, along with revenue. But it was actually customer acquisition that took the biggest hit, as you can see from this graph. So they clearly had a problem with customer acquisition. But this graph masks the underlying problem. They were getting orders in, but most of those orders were coming through discounted offers. But they weren't generating repeat business. Their customer behavior changed around 2018. They were acquiring the wrong type of customer. This graph helps to show what I mean by that. This shows basically by year of acquisition, what proportion of the people who were acquired in that year were retained or immediately lost. Back in 2014, you can see that the people they acquired were pretty loyal. In 2015, 40% of them came back and 60% were lost. Now that's a fairly typical proportion. Okay? I've seen 40% of customers retained in many different retailers, certainly in e-commerce, it's very common. I've even seen it in the charity sector, where you get probably a large proportion of people who will donate once and then you'll never actually convert them to another donation. But on this graph, you can see that from 2016, it had declined. Marketing spend was still generating orders, but it was not generating customer value. And that's a much, much more important metric. They were not getting enough advocates of their brand and not enough loyal customers. And that means their business was really struggling at that point. The message from this, though, is that it's the detailed, bespoke customer analytics that we used to highlight the underlying problem, which was really about their acquisition challenge versus retention. And then we set about rectifying it, of course, but I won't talk about that today. So this is an interesting graph. Not very exciting, is it? Well, to a data person like me, I actually think it's quite good. And the reason it's quite good is because of what's happening on the left-hand side of that graph. This is from an e-commerce subscription business, and they looked to us to support them during their period of rapid growth. The left-hand side of this graph is interesting because it's wiggly, and that's a technical term for the data people out there. At different points in time, they were acquiring customers that delivered really good value, and at other points in time, they were acquiring customers that were delivering less value. In effect, we could identify that by analyzing those different points in time, what their marketing was doing right at times versus what it was doing wrong. And like the previous example, it's based on analyzing customers, not orders. We're measuring customer behavior across different groups of customers. And the main objective to this business at this point in time was simply to learn what could work well so they could repeat it, learn what didn't work well to avoid doing it again in the future. And a customer cohort analysis like this is a great tool to deliver that learning. The next one I want to talk about is from a client of ours called Worldwide Cancer Research. They've had a long-standing fundraising program that's been going for 30 or 40 years now. It's a very successful program, and it was certainly one that would be hard to improve. But we managed to. And how do we do that? We changed the perspective. We analyzed the people, the supporters, and not the campaigns. We came up with an approach which we affectionately know as heartbeat. So every time somebody donates is like a beat of that heart. And we discovered that different supporters had very, very different behaviors. Came up with 3 tests of supporters who were not donating very much. And what we did here is we actually reduced campaign frequency to those supporters. We expected to save costs and hopefully deliver the same amount of income. But we got this astounding result here. By contacting them less, we actually got more donations. We increased the number and the value of the donations. It's a pretty astounding result. By personalizing the contact frequency, it boosted the program. This example is more about behavior change in terms of one we've actually tried and instigated. So we've instigated that change by changing our marketing strategy, unlike the previous 2 examples. But again, it all comes from that customer analytics. I'm particularly proud of this one. We were actually the runner-up to Marketing Campaign of the Year award at the British Data Awards last year. The final one I'm going to come on to is back to COVID. You saw earlier from the slide, we saw for our client, we had a 1,200% increase in sales. Phenomenal growth in a very short space of time. But the interesting question about that is what would happen next? Is it just a one-off boost? They had a massive impact on sales, fantastic, but not delivering any long-term value. Or is it a more permanent change in customer behavior? It's a very important distinction, I'm sure you'll understand, to help forecast your future income. How do we tackle that? We measured retention, of course. And from this graph, you can see that retention was actually higher pre-COVID. You probably expect that. It did drop off a little bit. But it didn't decline by that much, and that's really positive. Some customers did change their behavior fundamentally, but that was not the dominant behavior. And on the right-hand side, you can see it was different for businesses compared to individuals. The decline was worse in businesses. Many businesses were forced to go online with this particular client during lockdowns. And so there was a change away from that natural behavior. So we kind of expected the impact would be worse on businesses. The other interesting behavior change, though, we spotted, though, was this. We measured the percentage of customers who are reordering within 30 days. And as you can see from this graph, the pre-COVID period up to the COVID spike, it actually increased. More people were reordering within 30 days within the COVID period than before. But what's really interesting about this is since COVID, I'll say since COVID, but since those lockdowns and now that we're out of it, that retention reorder period has actually stayed higher than it was pre-COVID. I'll also point out one other thing we've got on this slide. You can see there we've got two different segments within the businesses. So we built them a segmentation model. We've only shown two of the segments, but the other ones, each of those segments had different behavior in terms of retention. Segmentation is always a good way of understanding behavior. Identify the different groups within your audience that do have different behavior. Your audience, I'm sure, will have segments. Without segmenting your audience, you've got to remember you're back to that aiming for the average, as I was talking about earlier, which is never optimal. One other example I decided not to include here. It's for a client where we did a customer profiling exercise. And what we found there is by analyzing the customer cohorts over time, their customer profile had completely changed. It was originally quite affluent, and it was very clear from the profile that the people they were acquiring at that point in time were very affluent. But it's flattened massively. As their marketing strategy changed, the customer profile changed, and the customer behavior of their is now also starting to change. The only reason I mention this one is because of the important dimension. Time is always an important dimension in any data work, in any segmentation model. So, I'm going to sum up pretty quickly. 4 behavior changes, 4 business issues. 2 of those related to acquiring the right type of customer, and acquisition versus retention. The third one was about personalizing contact frequency. Now, personalization usually refers to changing the message content, but in this example, changing the message frequency had a massive impact. And the final one was, of course, on COVID and the impact on retention, a vital measure of customer behavior. 2 pre-COVID, 2 during COVID. But COVID is not the theme. It's change that's that underlying theme. Either identifying that change is happening or deliberately bringing about that change by changing your marketing strategy. Both those approaches have value to any organization, and it's data that will tell you these stories. The one thing they do have in common, though, is that behavior change only came to light through the analysis of that first-party data. Each of these examples I've shared here had very, very different solutions. If you want to have a chat about those, feel free to pop by our stand. But just very quickly to sum up, customer behavior is always changing, and it always will. That's fine, that's okay, but have a strategy in place for how you will identify it and how you will react to it. You really need to stay on top of your customer base, analyze their behavior in detail, so you can spot those changes and you can react quickly with the appropriate messages. And I would say that it's only bespoke customer analytics that will help determine the interventions that we, as marketeers, can make and when to make them. Thank you.
To be absolutely honest, we have no time for questions now, which is fine. What I suggest you do is grab Daniel upstairs or go and have a chat with him on the stands, see how things go from there. We're going to break for lunch now, folks. We'll be back in this room in about 50 minutes' time. Don't forget to enter the prize draws, because otherwise, how will they get your details? Right. Have a nice lunch.